At 3:14 in the morning, Kang Do-yoon received the call that should have stopped everything. His wife was in labor. His son was coming. He looked at the phone. He looked at Yuniseo lying in the silk sheets of a Jeju Island villa, her hand resting on his arm like she owned it. Then he set the phone face down on the nightstand. "Not yet," he said. Not to his wife, not to his lieutenant begging him to take the jet. He said it to himself, like a man who still believed he controlled what was already slipping through his fingers forever. 6 hours later, at 6:47 in the morning, Amara Whitfield gave birth to their son alone. No husband, no apology. Just a chair that stayed empty, and a woman who finally understood exactly who she had married. If that had happened to you, if the person who promised to love you chose somewhere else while you were screaming in pain, what would you do? Before we go further, if this story is already hitting somewhere deep, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into part 1. The first thing you need to understand about Amara Whitfield is that she was never the kind of woman who needed saving. That matters. Because by the time people heard her story, and they would hear it, all of it, the version that spread online made her sound like a victim from the first page. A woman who married the wrong man. A woman who didn't see the signs. Those people didn't know Amara. She was 35 years old, with a master's degree in financial law in hands that had personally restructured 4 companies. Do-yoon's father had nearly run into the ground before Do-yoon took over. She didn't fall into his world by accident. She walked in with her eyes open, her own briefcase, and a red pen she used without asking permission. She had seen what Do-yoon was before she loved him. That was the whole complicated truth of it. She loved him anyway. Do-yoon, Kang Do-yoon, 41 years old, Korean-born, Seattle-built, was not the man his organization believed him to be, which was exactly why he had survived long enough to build something worth protecting. His father had ruled through fear. Pure, blunt, stupid fear. Do-yoon ruled through precision. He studied people the way a surgeon studies the body. Not to understand it, but to know where it broke down. He knew which rivals had gambling problems, which port inspectors had second mortgages, which federal agents had been passed over for promotion too many times, and started to resent the system that overlooked them. He knew how to find the crack and widen it without anyone realizing they'd been split open. Amara understood all of this when she married him. What she didn't account for, what nobody ever accounts for, is how slowly power corrupts the domestic things, the ordinary things. The way a man stops asking how your day went, not because he's cruel, but because he no longer needs to know. The way security teams appear outside your bedroom door framed as protection, but function as containment. The way a man who once sat across from you at 2 in the morning, arguing about contract language, now communicates through assistance. Not through cruelty, through absence. That was Do-yoon's particular damage. He didn't rage, he didn't control with his fists. He withdrew. And the withdrawing was so gradual, so smoothly executed, that Amara spent 2 years trying to diagnose the marriage before she finally stopped wondering if it was her fault. It wasn't. But understanding that didn't make the bed feel less empty. She was 38 weeks pregnant the morning she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Seattle penthouse, watching 3 black suitcases move toward the private elevator. Do-yoon stood beside the luggage, wearing a charcoal wool coat she had bought him for his 39th birthday. Adjusting his cufflinks with the focused attention he gave everything except her. "Jeju," she said, not a question. "Shipping partners. It's been on the calendar for 6 weeks. So has my due date." He turned and looked at her then. Full eye contact. The kind that used to mean something, that used to make her feel like the only specific person in any room he entered. Now it was just a technique. She had learned to see the difference. "You're not due for 10 days, he said. "I'll be back before anything happens." "What if something happens early?" "Then Minjae has the jet standing by. 3 hours, Amara, door to door." She put one hand on her stomach. Not for his benefit. She wasn't performing. It was just habit by then, reaching for Eli when she needed something solid to hold on to. "Do-yoon." Her voice didn't shake. She had made sure of that. "I'm asking you not to go." He kissed her on the forehead, carefully, controlled. "I'll call when I land." The elevator closed. She stood at the window for a long time after. She found the photograph 2 days later. It wasn't sent to her. It wasn't planted where she'd find it, or maybe it was, she'd never know for certain. But she was scrolling through a Korean-language business forum that tracked Pacific shipping deals, something she still monitored out of habit, and there it was. A photograph taken at a villa she didn't recognize, sunlight cutting hard across an outdoor breakfast table. Do-yoon, a coffee cup, and Yoona Seo. Yoona Seo, 40 years old, Korean-American logistics executive, the kind of beautiful that reads as expensive in every photograph, her bare foot resting against Do-yoon's ankle beneath the table, while his hand sat behind her chair in the specific way men touch women they have already claimed. The photograph had been posted as background color in an article about Pacific Rim shipping consolidation. His face was half visible. Most people would have scrolled past. Amara had built a career on noticing the details that other people's eyes slid over. She put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood very still. She wasn't surprised. That was the worst part. The complete absence of surprise. Like a word you've been trying to remember for weeks, suddenly surfacing in the shower. Oh, that. Of course. She thought about screaming. She thought about calling him and breaking every piece of composure she had spent 3 years assembling in this marriage. She thought about throwing the phone into the $60,000 kitchen that had never once felt like hers. Instead, she called Zora. Her younger sister answered on the second ring with the particular tone she used when she was trying to sound casual, which meant she already knew why Amara was calling. Z, Amara said, just her sister's name. Nothing else. A pause. Long enough to confirm everything. How long? Amara said. Amara. How long, Zora? Another pause. She could hear her sister pressing 2 fingers to her forehead the way she did when she was about to say something irreversible. I found out 8 months ago, Zora said. I wanted to be sure before I… Amara, I know that's not good enough. Is it only Yoona? Silence. Is it only Yoona, Zora, yes or no? No. Amara set the phone down on her very gently, like setting down something fragile that wasn't hers. She stood in the kitchen that wasn't hers, in the penthouse that wasn't hers, carrying the one thing in this marriage that was completely and entirely hers, and she breathed, in, out, again. She picked the phone back up. I need Gideon's number, she said. Gideon Price, divorce attorney, former federal prosecutor, a man with a specific talent for separating the financial lives of people who had built something together and now needed to burn the architecture apart without collapsing themselves in the process. I have it, Zora said immediately. Of course she did. Of course. Her sister had been quietly preparing for the moment. Amara stopped being unable to see what was directly in front of her. That almost broke Amara open right there. The realization that people who loved her had been carrying this longer than she had. She called Gideon Price that afternoon. She did not call Do-yoon. 3 nights after that, she was lying in bed at 2 a.m. with Eli pushing steadily against her ribs when her body made the decision the calendar wasn't ready for. The first contraction came as a low, dragging pull that she initially tried to dismiss as false labor. Then the second one arrived 15 minutes later and she stopped trying to dismiss it. She called Zora first, then the hospital. Then, because she was still the woman she had always been, someone who believed in informing people of the consequences they had created, she called Do-yoon. He didn't answer. She left a voicemail. Precise. No hysteria. My water, I'm going to St. Matthew's. You should know. He called back 24 minutes later. She had already been admitted. Contractions were 8 minutes apart. I'm getting the jet, he said immediately. You've been in Korea for 4 days, she said. The flight is 11 hours. I'm getting on it right now, said Do-yoon. She waded through a contraction, breathing through it the way the instructor at the class he skipped had taught her to. When it passed, she said, Min-jae told me 3 hours door to door, unless he lied to both of us. A silence. Then, that's not… There's a flight window. Whether… I'm going to hang up now and focus on this. She hung up. What happened next, she didn't learn until later. It came from Min-jae. Not willingly, but Min-jae was loyal to Do-yoon in the complicated way men are loyal to leaders. They've also grown to resent, which means eventually the truth surfaces sideways. At the villa, after Amara's call, Min-jae had stood in the doorway and told Do-yoon directly the jet was on the runway. Crew was standing by. They could be wheels up in 40 minutes if Do-yoon moved right now. 11 hours, maybe 10 with a favorable wind. He would be cutting it close, but he could get there. And Yuna, wearing Do-yoon's shirt, standing in the kitchen doorway of a villa that had been booked under a company subsidiary, had said very quietly, "Labor takes time, first babies especially. You could make the morning meeting and still catch most of it." Do-yoon had looked toward the bedroom. Then he had looked at the woman in his shirt. Then he had said the two words that would dismantle everything he hadn't yet realized he was about to lose. Not yet. Amara delivered Eli at 6:47 in the morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Lungs that announced themselves immediately. Eyes that opened within the first few minutes and found Zora's face, because Zora was the one gripping Amara's hand. Zora was the one counting breaths. Zora was the one who said, he's here, look at him." While the chair positioned beside the hospital bed for the father remained exactly as the nurses had left it. Empty. Perfectly, precisely, permanently empty. Amara held her son against her chest and felt the specific exhaustion of labor mixing with something colder. Not grief exactly, not yet. More like the feeling of a door swinging shut, clean, final. The kind of sound you don't hear with your ears. Do-yoon arrived 14 hours later. She was sitting up in the hospital bed when he walked in. Eli was in her arms, asleep. Zora was in the chair. The chair, beside her. Do-yoon was carrying a jewelry box. Sapphire bracelet, she assumed. That was his language for apology. Beautiful objects from expensive places, proof that he had thought of her with his wallet, which he confused for thinking of her with himself. He stopped when he saw Zora in the chair. Zora didn't move. "Amara," he started. "Don't." Her voice was quiet. Eli was sleeping. She was not going to wake her son with raised voices. Do-yoon set the box on the tray table. "I got here as fast as what?" She looked at him. Just looked, the way she had learned to look at legal documents when she was trying to find what they were hiding. "What exactly was it that prevented you from leaving when I called?" He opened his mouth. "Min-jae told me that the jet was ready," she said, "so I want to understand what the actual obstacle was." He said nothing. "Did someone physically prevent you from leaving?" A long, terrible silence. "No," he said. She nodded once. "Like a judge who has already written the ruling and is simply completing the procedural record. There's something you missed," she said, "besides the obvious. You missed the moment before the anesthesia fully worked when I called your name. Not because I was scared, not because I needed you to save me. Just because pain does that, it reaches for the person your body still believes is there. And you weren't." She looked down at Eli. "Your son was born at 6:47 this morning. That's what I want you to know. Not that I was in pain, not that I was angry, just that he arrived, and the chair was empty." Do-yoon looked at his son's face for the first time. Something moved across his expression that Amara had stopped being willing to interpret. "I'm going to need you to leave," she said, "and I'm going to give you one more chance. One, to come back at 6 this evening and discuss what happens next for Eli. Not for us, for him." He nodded. 6, she said. 6, he agreed. He was gone by 5:38 that same afternoon, called away to a crisis at one of his Seattle docks. Min-jae texted her, as if the explanation was an apology, as if she hadn't already anticipated exactly this. 6 o'clock came. The chair was empty. Amara sat beside it for a full 5 minutes, holding Eli, looking at the space where his father was supposed to be. Then she made the call she had been building toward for 3 years without realizing it. "Zora, we're leaving. Tonight. I need you to bring what I told you about." She signed the divorce petition the following morning. And then Amara Whitfield, with a 6-day-old son, a sister, 4 prepaid cash cards, and 12 years of knowledge about exactly how Do-yoon's organization operated, walked out of that hospital into a gray Seattle morning and disappeared so completely that a man who commanded hundreds of loyal, dangerous people could not find a single trace of her for weeks. Not because she ran, because she knew exactly where every camera was, exactly which vehicles were monitored, exactly which digital trails led nowhere, and how to make the ones that led somewhere point in the wrong direction entirely. She had spent years building the respectable infrastructure of Do-yoon's empire. Now she used everything she had learned to vanish inside it. She left one thing behind: On the kitchen counter of the penthouse, beside the unopened sapphire bracelet, her wedding ring, and a note, handwritten, 7 lines long. You chose where you wanted to be when our son entered the world. I watched you make that choice from a hospital room you never arrived at. I am not leaving because I am broken. I am leaving because Eli deserves a life where he is no one's second priority. You know what I know. You know I can disappear. Find a better reason to look for us than the name on those companies. He has your eyes. I'll let him decide the rest when he's old enough to understand what I'm telling him. Do-yoon read the note standing in his kitchen at 11 o'clock at night. He read it 3 times. Then he sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, not at the table, just down, on the cold tile, with his back against the cabinet, holding a wedding ring that had once meant something specific and now meant only the size of what he had thrown away. Outside, somewhere in the city he controlled, a photographer was already preparing to send another set of images to a journalist who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to publish them. Photographs of Do-yoon and Yuna, taken hours before Eli was born. And Do-yoon, sitting on that kitchen floor, had no idea yet that his marriage hadn't simply ended. It had been engineered. The photographs went public at 7:22 on a Tuesday morning. Do-yoon was in his home office when Min-jae called, and he knew from the first half-second of silence before Min-jae spoke that whatever was coming wasn't something money could immediately fix. Min-jae Han had been with Do-yoon for 11 years. He had delivered bad news before, rival incursions, federal inquiries, a warehouse fire that killed 2 men and cost $4 million to make disappear from the public record. Min-jae always led with the problem, clinical, fast. This time he paused. That pause was its own kind of news. "It's out," Min-jae said. All 3 outlets picked it up simultaneously. Korean language press first, then 2 Seattle business blogs. There are 8 photographs. The villa, the breakfast table, one on the beach. Another pause. One taken outside a clinic. Timestamp on that one puts it at 4 in the morning, Jeju time. Do-yoon already knew what 4 in the morning Jeju time translated to on the Seattle clock. I didn't say anything. The timestamp is being highlighted specifically, Min-jae said. Every article is leading with the timestamp. Who sent them? We're working on that. Min-jae. His voice was flat. Not angry. Flat, which was worse. Who sent them? Unknown source. The outlet that broke it received an encrypted package 3 days ago. They held it until they verified the timestamps independently. Min-jae stopped. Then, boss, the comments are already... I don't care about the comments. Our partners in Vancouver care. I've had 2 calls already this morning. Shinwoo Park wants a meeting before end of week. He's framing it as routine, but it's not routine. No. Do-yoon set the phone on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment. Not at anything on the wall. Just at the space, the neutral surface of it, something that didn't require him to calculate anything. He gave himself 3 seconds of that. Then he picked the phone back up. Get me the original file metadata if the outlet will share it. Find out when each photograph was taken relative to Amara's hospital admission. Find out who knew my schedule on Jeju outside of the course 6 people. He stopped. And find Amara. Silence. Min-jae. We were trying. Her phone has been dark since the morning she left the hospital. No card activity on the joint accounts. Her personal card hasn't been used either. She has cash. Yes. She knows our surveillance infrastructure. A longer silence. Yes, boss. So she's not lost. She's gone. He said it the way you say a fact you've accepted, even though accepting it cost you something real. Focus on the photographs for now. I want to know who leaked them before I do anything else. He ended the call. The office was quiet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle was doing what it did in November. Pressing gray against everything. Rain so fine it was almost mist, the kind of weather that made the city look like it was trying to disappear into itself. He opened his laptop and pulled up the articles. He read them without expression. All 3. Every caption, every highlighted timestamp. A journalist at the Korean language outlet had done her research. She had pulled his company filings, identified 3 subsidiaries connected to the Jeju Villas holding company, and noted that Amara Whitfield Kong had not appeared at any public function in 4 weeks, which the journalist framed as unavailable for comment, but which any careful reader understood as something sharper. The 8th photograph was the one that did something to his chest. It was him. Just him, alone on the villa's lower terrace, phone to his ear. The timestamp in the corner read 6:49 a.m. Jeju time. He had been standing on that terrace. He remembered it exactly now, because Min-jae had called him with the news. Not that Amara was in labor, that Eli had been born, that it was over, that it had happened, that his son was in the world and he had not been in the room. He had taken the call on that terrace, and someone had photographed him doing it. He closed the laptop. The Shinwoo Park meeting happened Thursday, not in Vancouver. Do-yoon refused to travel on someone else's terms, and Park knew better than to push it, so they sat in a private dining room of a Korean restaurant in the International District that Do-yoon had been using for sensitive meetings for 9 years, a place where the owner understood that certain corner tables were never available to the public on certain days, and where the background noise of the kitchen was calibrated specifically to make recording difficult. Park arrived with one associate. Do-yoon came with Min-jae. Both men understood the arithmetic of that. Equal numbers, controlled environment, nobody performing weakness. Park was 63, a heavy-set man who had built his Vancouver operation over 30 years and who expressed concern the way experienced, dangerous men always expressed it, slowly, politely, with perfect deniability. "I'm not here to question your personal life," Park said, after they'd ordered and before the food arrived. "I want to be clear about that." "Then what are you here to question?" Park smiled. The smile of a man who has prepared his next sentence carefully. "Stability, operational continuity. When the public face of an organization becomes complicated, it creates attention. Attention creates pressure. Pressure creates mistakes." He lifted his tea. "We've had a productive relationship for 7 years, Do-yoon. I would like to continue having one. Nothing about my operations has changed. The Amara situation is a private matter. The companies in her name are not a private matter." Park set his cup down. "Not hard, precisely. 3 of the most significant clean assets in your legitimate portfolio carry her signature. If she's disappeared, and the people I speak to suggest she has genuinely disappeared, then those assets are in a complicated position." Do-yoon looked at him. "I'm managing it," he said. "I'm sure you are." Park folded his hands on the table. "I only want to make sure that management includes a timeline, because my people get nervous when they can't see a timeline. Tell your people that their nervousness is noted and that I'll be in touch when there's something to communicate." Park studied him for a moment, looking for the crack, the same way Do-yoon looked for cracks in everyone, finding nothing on the surface, which meant, as it always did with Do-yoon, that the damage was interior. "There's also the matter of the photographs," Park said. "What about them?" "Someone released them strategically, simultaneously. 3 outlets, coordinated timing, curated selection." He paused. "That's not a scorned woman's revenge. That's an operation." Do-yoon said nothing. "I'm not suggesting I know who," Park said. "I'm suggesting that if someone in your organization coordinated that release, the implications for every partnership connected to your name become significant." The food arrived. Both men stopped talking while plates were set down, and Do-yoon spent those 20 seconds reading Shinwoo Park's face with the focused attention he usually reserved for legal documents. Park wasn't threatening. He was genuinely nervous, which meant Park didn't know who had done this either, which meant it hadn't come from Vancouver. "Enjoy your meal," Do-yoon said, "and tell your people the timeline is my business." The drive back to the penthouse was 22 minutes. Do-yoon spent 19 of them staring out the window while Min-jae drove and said nothing, because Min-jae had been with him long enough to understand when silence was the only appropriate offering. At the 3-minute mark before they arrived, Do-yoon said, "Malcolm." Min-jae's hands tightened on the steering wheel, barely visible. But Do-yoon saw it. "What about him?" Min-jae said. "Where was he the week I was in Jeju?" "Seattle. I can confirm the first 3 days. After that..." Min-jae stopped. "After that." "I'd need to pull his access logs. Pull them." "If he sees that we've pulled them, he'll see that we've pulled them," Do-yoon said. "That's fine. I want him to know I'm looking." Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Then, "You think it's Malcolm?" "I think Malcolm has been my financial strategist for 14 years and has been watching me build the legitimate side of this organization with my wife's name on the paperwork. And I think Malcolm is smart enough to understand what Amara's disappearance does to the ownership structure of 4 companies." Do-yoon looked out the window again. I think someone knew my schedule in Jeju down to the hour and used it to keep me in place while Amara was in labor. And I think the photographs were released not to embarrass me but to accelerate her leaving. Min-jae said nothing for several seconds. If that's true, he finally said, and you move on Malcolm without proof. I'm not moving on Malcolm. I'm looking at him. Do-yoon turned. There's a difference. For now. The access logs came back the next morning, and they told a partial story, which was itself information, because a complete story would have meant Malcolm had nothing to hide, and an absence of data in specific windows meant someone had known what to scrub and when. Malcolm re-arrived at Do-yoon's office that same afternoon for a scheduled weekly briefing, and nothing in his face or posture suggested he knew the logs had been pulled. I was 60 years old, compact and precise, the kind of man who wore the same style of dark suit in slightly different cuts, and who had a habit of arriving exactly 4 minutes early for every meeting, which Do-yoon had always read as discipline, but which he now read as performance. They talked about the Vancouver relationship, about the impact of the press coverage on 2 pending port contracts, about the legal review timeline for the asset restructuring that had been on the agenda for months. Do-yoon watched him talk. He had always been good at watching people, but there was a specific weight to watching someone you had trusted for 14 years through the lens of a question you didn't yet have enough information to answer. It was like trying to see a room in the dark. You knew the furniture was there, you just couldn't yet confirm the shape of it. The Amara situation, Malcolm said, near the end of the meeting, sliding a folder across the desk. I've had our legal team outline options for establishing administrative control over the assets currently in her name while she's unreachable. It would require a court process, but given the circumstances of her departure, she's not unreachable, Do-yoon said. She's choosing not to be reached. Malcolm held the pen he'd been using loosely, in the careful way of a man calibrating his next move. Of course. But from a business continuity standpoint, I'll manage the business continuity. Do-yoon didn't touch the folder. Leave that with me. Malcolm nodded, collected his papers. 4 minutes later, he was gone, and Do-yoon sat in his office with the folder on the desk in front of him, unopened, thinking about what it meant that Malcolm had prepared it. Not that he had prepared it. That was Malcolm's job. That was reasonable. But that he had prepared it fast. That he had a legal team already outlining options for controlling assets currently registered to a woman who had only been gone for days. Preparation took time. Someone had started that preparation before Amara left. He called Min-jae. Yunaseo's calendar for the last 6 months, he said. Specifically, any overlap with Amara's medical appointments. That'll take today, Min-jae. Meanwhile, in Portland, Amara was learning that silence had a texture she had never noticed when her life was surrounded by security teams and Seattle skylines and the constant ambient hum of Do-yoon's organization operating around her like weather. The apartment was small, second floor of a building that smelled faintly of old carpet and the Thai restaurant on the ground level, located in a neighborhood where people minded their business with the specific determination of people who had their own situations and had decided not to expand the radius of their concern. Eli slept in a second-hand bassinet that Zora had sourced from a woman 3 blocks over who'd sold it for $30 cash. Amara recorded everything. She had bought a blue notebook from a drugstore on the corner, and she wrote in it every morning after Eli's first feeding. Not full sentences always, sometimes just fragments. 3 weeks, 2 days. First real smile or gas, impossible to tell. Eyes tracked the window light now. Zora said his fist looked like Do-yoon's when he's sleeping. I didn't tell her I'd already noticed. She had not cried. She had come close twice. Once in the first week when Eli had a fever that climbed to 101 and she sat on the bathroom floor of the small apartment with him against her chest, waiting for the acetaminophen to work. And once when she was feeding him at 2 in the morning, and some combination of exhaustion and the specific silence of being entirely responsible for a person broke through her composure briefly. She had let herself feel it for exactly 4 minutes, counted them on the clock above the stove, which she could see from where she was sitting. Then she had rebuilt the composure. She was not afraid of rebuilding. She had rebuilt things before. Zora, sleeping in the second bedroom on a mattress they'd bought for $200 cash, woke at 3 most mornings to take a feeding so Amara could sleep. She didn't talk about what they'd left. She didn't ask what came next. She just showed up at 3 in the morning and took Eli and sat in the armchair by the window, and Amara would lie down and be unconscious within 90 seconds. And she was grateful for her sister in a way she could not have articulated without breaking. She had not used a card. She had not called anyone from her old life except Gideon Price through an encrypted app to confirm that the divorce petition had been received and properly filed. She had not looked at Do-yoon's name on her phone, which she had replaced with a prepaid device 2 days after leaving. She had once looked at the photograph. Not the villa photograph. She had no desire to look at that again. A different one. A photograph she had on the old phone before she wiped it, one that Zora had printed for her before they left Seattle. Do-yoon, 3 years ago, at a company event, laughing at something she had said. Genuine laughter, the kind his face didn't manufacture. She had loved that version of him in a way that was real and specific and not something she was interested in retroactively dismissing. Because pretending it had never been real would mean pretending she had been stupid, and she hadn't been stupid. She had been wrong about what he would choose when choosing became necessary. That was different. She put the photograph in the back of the blue notebook and didn't look at it again. The package appeared on a Wednesday. She came home from a pediatric appointment, Eli's 6-week checkup, conducted under the name she'd given the clinic, paid cash, to find a small padded envelope propped against her apartment door. No return address. No postage. Hand-delivered. She stood in the hallway holding Eli against her shoulder and looked at the envelope for a long time before she picked it up. Inside, a silver baby rattle. Expensive. The kind sold at boutique children's stores that mostly catered to people who could spend $300 on something a 6-week-old would ignore. And beneath the rattle, folded once, a photograph. Her. Eli and the carrier strapped to her chest. Outside the pediatric clinic she had just left, shot from across the street, the angle suggesting someone in a parked vehicle. The appointment had been this morning. The package was already here. Her stomach dropped the way it does when the body understands something before the brain has processed it. A cold freefall that had nothing to do with temperature. She put Eli in the bassinet, washed her hands, stood at the kitchen window and looked at the street below without touching the curtain. Then her prepaid phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she thought about the photograph and answered. Mrs. Kang. A voice she recognized immediately, smooth, controlled. The specific, careful diction of a man who had spent 40 years ensuring that nothing he said could be used against him without significant additional evidence. I hope the relocation has been comfortable. Malcolm Rahi. This number isn't in your contact list, she said. Her own voice was steady. She was furious about how steady it was because steady meant she wasn't going to give him anything, and she needed to stay in that state. It isn't. I have resources that don't require contact lists. A brief pause. I want to discuss the transfer documents, specifically your signature on 4 asset transfer instruments that would formalize the restructuring of companies currently registered under your name into a holding structure that better reflects the current leadership situation. I'm not signing anything. I expected you'd say that initially. His voice was pleasant, professionally pleasant, the way bad news sounds when it's delivered by someone who's been paid to deliver it with a smile. I want you to take some time to reconsider. Not too much time, but some. Malcolm. She kept her voice low. I know you had someone outside that clinic this morning. I know you know where I am. And I want you to understand that knowing where I am does not give you what you actually need, which is my willing signature on a legal document. A pause, longer than the others. You're right, he said, which is why I want this to be a conversation rather than a pressure situation. You're an intelligent woman. You understand the position. I understand it completely. Then you understand that the position includes your son. The sentence landed like a fist. Clean, direct, no ambiguity. Amara said nothing. I'm not threatening, Malcolm said, in the voice of a man absolutely making a threat. I'm describing a reality. Your son carries the Kong name in the legal documents filed at the time of his birth. That name has implications. Those implications are manageable, with the right paperwork in place. Without it, he stopped. Take a few days, think clearly. I'll call again. He ended the call. Amara stood in the kitchen for 60 seconds. Then she went to the bassinet and picked Eli up and held him. Not because she was panicking. She wasn't. Not exactly. But because she needed to confirm the weight of him, the realness of him, against every calculation she was now moving through at speed. She had been prepared to disappear. She had not been prepared for someone to make her son the leverage. Running further would not fix this. Portland to Chicago, to Houston, to anywhere. Malcolm clearly had resources that outpaced geography. Distance was not the answer anymore, which meant she needed to do something she had been explicitly trying not to do. She needed to call Do-yoon. Not because she trusted him, not because the marriage had any living tissue left in it, because Do-yoon was the only person on the planet with sufficient knowledge of Malcolm's operation to dismantle it, and because Eli was in danger, and because Amara Whitfield had never once in her life let pride make a decision that should have been made with strategy. She put Eli back in the bassinet. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the prepaid phone. Then she picked it up. She stared at the phone for 4 minutes before she dialed. Not because she was uncertain. Amara had moved past uncertainty. Somewhere between the silver rattle and Malcolm's voice, describing her son as an implication. The 4 minutes were for something else. For the specific discipline of making sure that when Do-yoon picked up, her voice would carry exactly what she intended and nothing she didn't. He answered on the second ring. She had expected that. He had been waiting for her to call since the morning she left the hospital. She knew him well enough to know he'd been carrying the phone like a man carrying something he wasn't sure how to set down. Amara. Just her name. No relief in it, no accusation, just recognition, careful and contained, the way you say the name of something you thought you'd lost in a fire. Malcolm found me, she said. Silence. Then the specific quality of Do-yoon's silence shifted. She could feel it even through a phone, the way the air in a room changes when something heavy gets set on a table. Where are you? That's not what I'm calling about. I'm calling because he wants signatures on asset transfer documents, and he used Eli as the framing for why I should cooperate. She kept her voice flat, factual. He had someone outside the pediatric clinic this morning. The photograph was waiting at my door when I got home. She heard him exhale. Not a sigh, something shorter and harder. The sound of a man absorbing a blow and immediately beginning to calculate response. Are you and Eli safe right now? For the moment. I need to know where you are. I know you do, and I need to know something first. She sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, the Portland evening had gone dark and wet, rain tapping the window in the irregular rhythm of weather that had no agenda. How long have you known it was Malcolm? The pause told her everything before he spoke. I started suspecting 3 days ago, he said. I don't have proof yet. Min Jae is pulling. I'm not asking about proof. I'm asking about suspicion. Her voice stayed level. How long? 3 days. And you didn't call me. I didn't know how to reach you. Your phone. You have people whose entire job is finding things that don't want to be found. Do-yoon, don't. She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and held them there. 3 days. He's been 3 days ahead of your suspicion, and he already knows where I am. She heard Do-yoon move, his chair, the sound of him standing, the slight shift in acoustics that meant he'd walk toward a window. She recognized the habit. He thought better standing at windows. Tell me where you are, he said again. I'm coming alone, no team, just me. If you come with a team, you'll lead them directly to Eli. I said alone. She looked at the bassinet across the room. Eli was asleep, his small fists loosely curled, his chest rising and falling with the complete uncomplicated faith of a person who had no idea yet that the world he'd been born into had been arranged by people with competing agendas before he took his first breath. She gave Do-yoon the address. He arrived in 9 hours, which meant he'd driven through the night. No private jet, no security convoy. A gray sedan she didn't recognize, a rental, she assumed, parked on the street below, and Do-yoon appearing at her door at 5:40 in the morning, wearing yesterday's clothes, no tie, carrying nothing except his phone and the specific exhaustion of a man who had made a 9-hour drive at speed with too many things to think about and no one to talk them through with. He looked older than she remembered. Not dramatically older, just the kind of older that accumulates in weeks rather than years when the right pressure is applied. He looked at her. She stepped back from the door without saying anything, which was the version of welcome she had available. He came inside. He looked immediately at the bassinet, just looked, from across the room, and something moved through his expression that she deliberately didn't try to read because reading it would cost her composure she needed. Is he? He's fine. He's sleeping. She moved to the kitchen. I made coffee. He sat at the small table and she poured 2 cups and sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the early morning quiet of the apartment with all the history of what they'd been and what they'd done to each other, sitting between them like a third person at the table. Tell me what Malcolm said exactly, he said. Every word you can remember. She did. She walked him through the call in sequence. The pleasant tone, the asset transfer framing, the clinic photograph, the line about Eli and implications. She watched Do-yoon's face as she talked. He held his coffee cup without drinking from it. His jaw tightened once, on the Eli line, and then he controlled it. When she finished, he set the cup down. He's been planning this longer than 3 days, Do-yoon said. The legal team he used to draft the transfer documents. I had Minji check the billing timestamps. The draft started 14 months ago. Amara looked at him. 14 months, she said. He was building the structure before any of this happened. Before the photographs, before Jeju, before... Do-yoon stopped. He looked at the table. He needed you gone from the marriage for the transfer to be contestable. And he needed me destabilized enough that I wouldn't see him moving until it was too late to stop him cleanly. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the refrigerator to cycle on and hum and cycle off. Yuna's calendar, Amara said quietly, overlaps with your last 6 prenatal appointments. Exact dates, exact clinic locations. His voice was controlled, but each word was landing like something he was placing very carefully. The way you place things when you know they're fragile and the damage from dropping them will be permanent. She had your medical schedule. Someone provided it to her, and she used it to make sure she was... He stopped again. Available, Amara said. Yes. She looked at her coffee. So the affair wasn't... She wasn't incidental. No. She was recruited. Do-yoon's hands moved on the table. Just a small shift. Fingers spreading slightly and then pulling back, like a man trying to physically contain what the sentence required him to acknowledge. I don't know if recruited is... I think she had her own motivations. I think Malcolm identified those motivations and created the conditions. But what happened between me and Yuna, he looked up. That wasn't something anyone forced. I made those choices. I want to be clear about that. Amara met his eyes. She had expected him to use Malcolm as an exit, to let the conspiracy absorb the weight of his own decisions, the way powerful men let circumstances carry blame that belongs to them personally. She had been braced for it. The fact that he didn't do it didn't change anything, but it landed differently than she'd prepared for. I know, she said, simply, and moved on because there was nothing else useful to do with that particular truth right now. What does Malcolm actually need from me? Walk me through the legal structure. For the next 40 minutes, they sat at that small kitchen table in the Portland apartment above the Thai restaurant, and Do-yoon explained, with the methodical precision that had always been his most formidable quality, exactly what Amara's signatures represented in the architecture of his legitimate empire. 4 companies. Originally established in her name as a legal shield during a federal investigation 3 years earlier, the arrangement had been intended as temporary. Do-yoon had treated it as paperwork. Malcolm had understood, from the moment those documents were signed, that Amara's name on those companies was not a formality. It was the load-bearing wall of the entire legitimate structure. Without her cooperation, the transfer of ownership required a court process that would take 18 months, generate significant public record, and expose the underlying financial architecture to a level of scrutiny that would be, Malcolm had clearly calculated, catastrophic for what remained of Do-yoon's operation. With her signature, it took a week, and whoever controlled those 4 companies controlled the one thing Do-yoon's criminal organization had always needed but could never fully manufacture on its own: a clean, documented, legitimate financial foundation that could absorb cash flow without triggering review. He doesn't want to destroy your operation, Amara said. He wants to own it. Yes, and he used my disappearance and the public situation to create a succession crisis that would make your partners nervous enough to be receptive to someone offering stability. Vancouver was already calling. Do-yoon's mouth was tight. Shinwoo Park came to me personally. Malcolm has been positioning himself as the steady hand for 3 months at minimum. Amara sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Just the plain white ceiling of a rented apartment she'd chosen because it was anonymous. And she thought about the specific architecture of what Malcolm had built. The patience of it. 14 months of preparation, layered and sequenced, each element triggering the next. The affair, cultivated or coincidentally leveraged. The Jeju meeting, timed to Eli's due date. The photographs, released at maximum impact. Her departure, anticipated and used. Do-yoon's destabilization, engineered and exploited. And her, at the center of it, the one signature between Malcolm and everything he wanted, assumed to be the weak point. She lowered her eyes from the ceiling. He made one mistake, she said. Do-yoon looked at her. He assumed that because I left you, I had no remaining interest in dismantling the people who helped make it happen. Something shifted in Do-yoon's expression. Not hope. She would have walked out of the room if she'd seen hope. But recognition. The look of a man who remembered exactly why he had once considered her the most valuable mind in any room she entered. It was Zora who heard it first. She had come out of the second bedroom at 6:15, barefoot and half awake, reaching for the coffee carafe when she stopped in the kitchen doorway and went completely still. Amara and Do-yoon both looked at her. Zora was staring at the window. "There's a car," she said, in the voice of someone speaking with great precision, because the alternative is panic. Dark blue. "It was there when I fell asleep at 2. It's still there." Do-yoon was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He moved to the side of the window, not in front of it, beside it, which told Amara he had specific experience with this particular threat geometry, and looked down at the street from the edge of the frame. "Single occupant," he said. "Or looks that way." He pulled back from the window. His voice had changed. The controlled weariness of the kitchen table conversation was gone. What replaced it was something older and more practiced. The specific sharpness of a man who had survived 15 years in a world where you either saw danger coming or you didn't get to be wrong about it twice. Back exit. "Building has a service door off the laundry room on the ground floor," Amara said. She had mapped it on day 1. She had mapped every building she'd been in since Portland. Opens to the alley, connects to the next block. Eli's bag. Already packed. She had kept it packed since the clinic photograph. Zora was already moving, coffee forgotten, the particular efficient speed of a woman who had spent the last 6 weeks operating in a state of managed emergency and had gotten very good at it. Amara lifted Eli from the bassinet. He stirred, made a sound, settled against her shoulder with the trusting heaviness of a sleeping child, who had not yet learned to be afraid of sudden movement in the dark. She pressed her hand to the back of his head and held him steady. Do-yoon was already at the apartment door, listening. "How did they find you?" he said, almost to himself. Then he turned and looked at her. "I drove a rental, paid cash. New phone." "I know," she said. "I know you didn't lead them." "Then how—" "The clinic," she said. It hit her as she said it, the sequence assembling itself with the grinding clarity of something obvious in retrospect. "Malcolm's man was outside the clinic yesterday morning. He didn't just photograph me. He photographed the building, the street, the angle. He would have captured your rental in the background if you—" She stopped. Do-yoon's face confirmed it. "I drove past first," he said quietly, "before I parked. I was checking the street." He looked at the door. "If they had someone watching from the clinic vicinity when I arrived—" "They connected the rental to you," Amara said, "and they already knew the address." The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then Do-yoon opened the apartment door. The service exit worked. The alley was clear, cold, narrow, smelling of wet concrete and the kitchen exhaust from the Thai restaurant. And they moved through it quickly, Amara carrying Eli, Zora close behind, Do-yoon at the rear with his eyes back on the alley entrance. They came out on the next block and turned north, away from the blue car, toward a small parking structure 3 streets up, where Zora had kept the backup vehicle. Another cash purchase, different plates, a decision Amara had insisted on in the first week, and that Zora had executed without question. They were inside it and moving within 4 minutes of leaving the apartment. Eli slept through all of it. They drove for 2 hours before anyone spoke. Do-yoon took the wheel. Amara didn't argue it, not because she was deferring to him, but because she was holding Eli in the back seat and working through every decision tree available to her simultaneously, and driving would have consumed the focus she needed elsewhere. Zora sat in the passenger seat and stared at the road and said nothing, because Zora had learned somewhere in the last 6 weeks that silence was sometimes the most useful thing she could contribute. Do-yoon drove north, not toward Seattle. That was the obvious move, which made it the wrong one, but northwest, toward the coast, putting distance between them and Portland without closing distance to Do-yoon's known territory. An hour in, Do-yoon said, "I need to tell you something." Amara looked at the back of his head. Minji found the full chain 2 days ago. I didn't call you because I didn't have a number and because I... He stopped. That's not the point. The point is that Yuna didn't just have your medical schedule. She waited. She had your phone records. Not current, historical. 2 years of them. Calls you made to Gideon Price's office, to your sister, to your personal accountant. Someone provided those to her 12 months ago. He exhaled. The source wasn't Malcolm. Amara went still. Then who? She said. Do-yoon's hands adjusted on the steering wheel. One small shift, both hands. A movement that in another person would have meant nothing, and in Do-yoon meant he was about to say something he had been carrying for 48 hours and hadn't yet found a way to put down without it breaking something irreparably. It came from inside my household staff, he said. Someone with regular physical access to the penthouse, who would have had reason to know your schedule, your calls, your routines. He paused. We traced it to a woman named Clara Park. She was your personal assistant for 18 months. The sentence arrived like a structural failure. Not loud, not dramatic, just the sensation of something that had been weight-bearing, giving way without warning. Clara Park, 32 years old, quick with a laugh. Someone who had known which coffee order Amara preferred on which days of the week, who had sat outside the hospital waiting room with a gift bag during Amara's 20-week scan, who had once spent 45 minutes helping Amara draft a message to Do-yoon for their 4th anniversary because Amara kept second-guessing the tone. Someone who had been inside her life, inside the daily facts of it. Why, Amara said. Financial. Malcolm had been paying her for 14 months. She didn't know what it was being used for, or she told herself she didn't. Do-yoon's voice was careful. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Amara looked at Eli sleeping against her chest. She thought about Clara sitting in that hospital waiting room with the gift bag. She thought about the smile, the specific easy smile of someone with no agenda, because that was what you believed at the time. She thought about how many ordinary moments of her private life Clara had translated into information and handed to Malcolm Rahi, who had handed pieces of it to Yuna Seo, who had used it to insert herself into exactly the right gaps. She didn't feel rage. Not yet. What she felt was something colder and more structural. The specific rearrangement that happens when you realize the breach was never from outside. It was already inside. It had been inside from the beginning, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, handing her coffee, knowing exactly which words she was struggling to find for her 4th anniversary. How much does Malcolm know about this meeting? She said. Her voice was steady, and she hated that it was steady because she wanted one moment of not being steady, and she could not afford it. He knows I came to Portland. He knows we left the apartment. He doesn't know where we are now. Do-yoon glanced in the rearview mirror, checking the road, not her face. Clara has been out of your household for 6 weeks. She has no current access. But Malcolm has had 6 weeks to use what she gave him to build a picture. Yes. So he knows our patterns, how I think, what I'll do when I feel cornered. Do-yoon said nothing, which was itself the answer. Amara looked out the window at the coastal highway running north, the Pacific somewhere off to the left in the dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed distance and made it impossible to tell how far anything was from anything else. Running was what Malcolm expected. She had been running, not out of panic, out of strategy, which was different, but strategy built on movement assumed that movement created safety, and the last 12 hours had dismantled that assumption at the foundation. Malcolm had resources, reach, and 14 months of preparation. He had a woman inside her household. He had photographs and legal documents and nervous partners in Vancouver. He had positioned himself between Do-yoon's organization and its own legitimate infrastructure, and he had used Amara as the key that locked the door without her ever knowing she was holding it. What he had not accounted for, what Clara could not have told him, because Clara had only seen the private version of Amara, the one who second-guessed anniversary messages and took long baths and cried exactly once a month about the state of her marriage, was what Amara Whitfield looked like when she stopped trying to protect herself and started trying to win. Those were different modes. She had been in the first one since Eli was born. She understood now that the first one was going to get her son killed or controlled or used as leverage in a succession war for an organization she had never wanted to be part of, by a man who had spent 14 months studying her life in granular detail and still fundamentally misunderstood what she was capable of when she had no more ground to lose. She shifted Eli against her shoulder. "Turn around," she said. Do-yoon looked at her in the rearview mirror. Actually looked, not the road check glance. Amara, not to Portland, to Seattle. She held Do-yoon's gaze in the mirror. Malcolm wants a meeting, a controlled environment where I bring the documents and sign them under whatever conditions he arranges. She paused. I'm going to give him the meeting. Zora turned around in the passenger seat. I'm going to let him think he's controlled every variable, Amara said. And then I'm going to give him the one thing he's been building toward for 14 months, a room with me in it, with the documents in my hands. And I'm going to use it to end this. Do-yoon held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at the road. His jaw was tight. His hands were steady on the wheel. She could see him calculating all the ways it could go wrong, all the variables Malcolm controlled, all the ways a plan built on offering yourself as bait required a level of trust in the people around you that the last 3 months had comprehensively destroyed. You'd be walking into a room he's prepared, Do-yoon said. Yes, she said. And he'll spend so much time watching me that he won't see what's coming from your side. Another silence. Longer. I need to make a call, Do-yoon said finally. To someone outside the organization. Someone Malcolm can't touch and doesn't know I have access to. Amara already knew who he meant before he said it. Rebecca Sloan, she said. Do-yoon glanced in the mirror again. You know about Sloan. I know about everyone who could take your organization apart if properly motivated, she said. I spent 3 years reading the documents you brought home, Do-yoon. You never noticed because you never thought to look. She held his gaze. Call her and tell Min-jae to get the Black Crane ledger. The words landed in the car like something dropped from height. Zora went absolutely still in the passenger seat. Do-yoon's hands tightened on the wheel, one brief, visible clench, and then released. The Black Crane ledger was the kind of document that existed in only one copy and in no digital form, maintained precisely because Do-yoon had always understood that anything written could be weaponized by whoever held it, and the only way to ensure that no one used it against you was to be the only one who held it. And the only one who knew it existed. It contained everything. Every transaction, every partnership, every arrangement that had kept Do-yoon's organization functional for 15 years. Rival operations, port officials, names that if delivered to Rebecca Sloan's office would dismantle not just Malcolm's ambitions, but the entire ecosystem that had made Do-yoon's criminal empire possible, including Do-yoon himself. He drove for 30 seconds without speaking. Then, quietly, with the specific gravity of a man making the last irreversible decision of a certain version of his life, he said, If I hand Sloan the ledger, there's no negotiating what happens to me. I know, Amara said. You know what I'd be walking into. Yes. She watched the back of his head, the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man who had just arrived at the edge of something and was looking down. Eli needs you out of this world, she said, not cruel, just precise, the way she had always been precise when the facts required it. Not dead, not in exile. Out. Completely. Whatever that costs. The highway stretched ahead of them, dark and wet, the kind of road that goes somewhere specific if you stay on it long enough. Do-yoon reached for his phone. He dialed Min-jae. Get the ledger, he said, when Min-jae picked up. And find me a number for Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca Sloan picked up on the fourth ring. She was a federal prosecutor out of the Western District of Washington, 53 years old, the kind of woman who had spent 20 years watching powerful men believe their money made them untouchable, and who had developed a specific professional patience around that particular delusion. She had been building a peripheral case around Do-yoon's shipping operations for 3 years, never quite enough to move on, always enough to keep watching. Min-jae had found her direct number through a contact Do-yoon had cultivated inside the U.S. Attorney's Office, precisely for moments when the legal architecture of a situation needed to be understood before it became a crisis. This had passed crisis 2 exits back. Do-yoon made the call from a rest stop outside Astoria, standing in the cold with the Pacific wind cutting through his jacket, while Amara sat in the back seat of the car feeding Eli and Zora stood 10 feet away pretending to look at her phone. Mr. Kong, Sloan said when he identified himself. No surprise in her voice. The absence of surprise was its own kind of information. I've been wondering when you'd call. Then you know why I'm calling. I have some ideas. A pause. Are you represented by counsel? Not for this conversation. That's inadvisable. I'm aware. I'm calling anyway. He turned his back to the wind. I have documentation of a criminal conspiracy operating within my organization and targeting federal assets. I want to discuss terms for providing that documentation to your office. A longer pause. He could hear her breathing, steady and deliberate, the breathing of a woman deciding how much of her hand to show. What kind of documentation? She said. The comprehensive kind. Another pause. And in exchange, protection for my wife and son. Immediate, independent of whatever else gets negotiated afterward. He said it without inflection, the same way he would have said it in any business negotiation, which was the only way he knew how to say things that mattered too much to say any other way. Whatever happens to me is a separate conversation. Their safety is not. Sloan was quiet for 5 seconds. Where are you now? Mobile, I can be in Seattle in 4 hours. Don't go to Seattle yet. There's a federal field office in Tacoma. I can have 2 agents there in 3 hours. Take your family there first. She paused. Can you get there without being followed? Yes. Mr. Kong. Her voice shifted, not softer but more precise, the shift of a prosecutor moving from preliminary to record. If the documentation is what you're implying it is, you understand your own exposure in this. I do. And you're proceeding anyway. He looked at the car. Through the rain-fogged window, he could see the shape of Amara's shoulder, the curve of her arm where she held Eli. Yes, he said. They reached the Tacoma field office at 9 in the morning. 2 agents, a man named Cortez and a woman named Park, no relation to Malcolm's contact, Amara verified that immediately, met them at a side entrance and took them through a process that was simultaneously professional and deeply strange, the way all significant threshold moments feel when you're living inside them. Amara answered questions. Cortez took Eli from her for exactly 4 minutes, while a female agent checked the diaper bag, and Amara stood with her hands still and her face neutral and counted the 4 minutes with the specific focused attention of a woman who had decided that losing composure here would cost her leverage she needed. Do-yoon sat in a separate room. She didn't ask what they were discussing. She already knew. Sloan arrived at 11. In person, she was compact and direct, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck and the kind of handshake that communicated exactly nothing about warmth and everything about competence. Mrs. Kang, she said. Whitfield, Amara said. Amara Whitfield. Sloan noted it. Ms. Whitfield, I need to walk you through what we're proposing and what we need from you. What they needed from her was the meeting with Malcolm. Sloan had been building toward Malcolm Rhee for 18 months from a different direction, financial crimes, money movement through shell companies connected to the Pacific Shipping Network, and Do-yoon's offer of the Black Crane Ledger had given her office the evidentiary foundation she needed to move. But moving on, Malcolm cleanly required confession evidence, recorded admission, or a documented criminal act committed in federal jurisdiction. Malcolm asking Amara to sign fraudulent asset transfer documents under duress while making implicit threats against her child in a location where federal surveillance was operating. That was all 3. He'll check for a wire, Amara said. We know. We have equipment that passes physical sweep up to 94th percentile of commercial detection hardware. Sloan folded her hands. The remaining 6% is on you. What does that mean specifically? It means if he has military-grade sweep capability, we go dark at some point. So we need you to keep him talking because everything before the signal dies is admissible. Amara looked at her. And if he figures it out before he's said enough? Sloan's expression didn't change. We'll have agents positioned at entry points. Response time is under 90 seconds from a go signal. She paused. I won't pretend that 90 seconds is nothing. No, Amara said. It's not. She thought about Eli, who was in the next room with Zora and Agent Cortez, who had produced a plastic ring of keys from somewhere that Eli was attempting to put entirely in his mouth with the single-minded determination of a person with no other agenda. What's the location? Amara said. Malcolm chose it himself, which was exactly what they'd wanted. When Do-yoon's people made contact through a cutout, presenting Amara as ready to negotiate, Malcolm had named the site within 20 minutes. An abandoned Washington State ferry terminal on the coast north of Olympia, decommissioned 6 years earlier, currently in a legal limbo between state ownership and private development. It was a location with no civilian foot traffic, multiple vehicle access points, and enough structural decay to make surveillance equipment installation look like weather damage. He had clearly prepared it in advance. which meant he had been planning for a meeting since before he called Amara in Portland, which meant the meeting was never going to be negotiation. It was going to be a controlled room where he dictated terms and she signed documents, and anyone who complicated that equation got managed with the 4 armed men he would absolutely bring regardless of whatever he agreed to in preliminary contact. Do-yoon laid all of this out to Min-jae over a call that evening, his voice carrying the flat, precise quality of a man who had already moved past the moral weight of what he was doing and was operating purely on execution. "He'll have 4 men minimum," Do-yoon said. "Yuna will be there. He won't leave her outside a meeting this significant. She has too much exposure. He'll sweep the terminal before Amara enters, and he'll sweep Amara herself." He paused. "Position the federal team at the north and east access points. Give them the go signal timing from my side. I'll be inside when it moves." "You're going inside," Min-jae said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Boss." "Min-jae." His voice closed the subject. "Inside. When it's done." The terminal was a 3-hour drive north. They left before dawn. Amara spent the drive sitting in the back seat with the transfer documents in a manila folder on her lap and her eyes on the dark highway, and her mind on every variable she could identify and every variable she couldn't. She had done this kind of preparation before, not for anything violent, but for high-stakes negotiations where the other party held more immediate leverage, and the only path to an acceptable outcome was a combination of patience, performance, and the precise identification of the moment when the balance of power shifted and you had to move. She was good at that identification. She had always been good at it. She just had never needed to be good at it in a building with armed men in her son's life as the unspoken stake. Zora was staying back. That had been the only fight of the last 12 hours. Not with Do-yoon, but with her sister, who had stood in the Tacoma field office corridor at 2 in the morning and told Amara with the specific quiet fury of someone who has been terrified for 6 weeks and has run out of diplomatic ways to express it. "You are not walking in there without me." "Eli needs someone he knows," Amara said. "Eli needs his mother." "Zora." "Don't Zora me in that voice. I know that voice." "Then you know I'm not asking." Amara put her hands on her sister's shoulders. "Eli has to be with someone he knows and trusts. If something, I need to know he won't be scared. That's the only thing I need to know right now. Can you give me that?" Zora's jaw worked. Her eyes went bright, and then she blinked it back with the determined efficiency of a woman who had been blinking things back for 6 weeks. "Yes," she said. "Thank you. I hate this. I know." The ferry terminal appeared out of the morning dark as a dark, blocky shape against the gray water. A structure that had once moved thousands of people daily and now stood empty, its loading ramps locked at fixed angles, its waiting areas open to weather through broken windows along the upper level. Snow had come in overnight, thin and wind-driven, sticking to the flat surfaces and blowing in loose curtains across the cracked tarmac of the vehicle staging area. Amara stood outside the car for a moment before going in. The cold came off the water with a particular directness, the kind of cold that didn't creep. It arrived all at once and stayed. She pulled her coat closed. The manila folder was under her arm. The transmitter Sloane's team had installed was woven into the lining of her left sleeve, passive, until activated by the specific pressure sequence she'd practiced 4 times with Agent Cortez. She breathed, once, twice. The cold air going in, the warm air going out. She went inside. The terminal's main waiting area was cavernous in the specific depressing way of large public spaces left unused. Ceilings that had once channeled commuter noise now, amplifying silence, row after row of bolted plastic seats crusted with grime, fluorescent fixtures hanging dark and crooked. At the far end, past the rows of seats and the boarded ticket windows, 3 industrial work lights had been set up on stands, filling the center of the space with a hard white glow that made everything outside it look darker by contrast. Malcolm Rhee stood in the center of that light. He looked exactly the same as he always had. That was the disorienting part. She had been constructing a version of him in her mind for weeks, a version that matched the threat he represented. And the reality was just Malcolm, 60 years old, dark suit, perfectly controlled posture, the pleasant neutral expression of a man in a meeting about quarterly returns. Eunice stood 6 feet to his left. She looked different than the photographs. Thinner. The elegance that read as expensive in media images was present in person, but carrying something underneath it, a tension in her jaw, a quality of alertness that was just slightly too high for someone who was supposed to be comfortable in this situation. Amara noted it and filed it. 4 men distributed themselves around the space at angles that were clearly not casual, 2 at the entry behind Amara, 2 flanking Malcolm's position. They weren't holding weapons visibly. They didn't need to. Ms. Whitfield, Malcolm said. The deliberate use of her maiden name, acknowledging the divorce petition, dismissing the marriage, communicating that he had been tracking the legal details. Thank you for coming. You didn't leave me much choice, she said. I gave you several days to arrive at the right decision. That's more than most people get. He gestured toward a folding table set up beside the work lights, 2 chairs on opposite sides, a document case lying flat on the surface. Shall we sit? She walked to the table. She sat. He sat across from her. Yuna remained standing. Amara put the manila folder on the table. Before we discuss anything, she said, I want to understand the full scope of what you're asking. I've read the drafts your legal team prepared. I want to hear it from you directly. Malcolm opened the document case. The transfer instruments move ownership of 4 companies currently registered in your name into a holding structure managed by, not the mechanics, Amara said, the purpose, what you actually intend to do with the companies once they're in the holding structure. A very small pause. Operational consolidation. Given the disruption to the Kong organization's leadership structure, you mean given that you arranged for Do-yoon to be publicly humiliated and operationally destabilized? Her voice was even. She watched his face. I want you to understand. I know about Yuna's calendar. I know the photographs were released simultaneously from a single encrypted package delivered 3 days before publication. She folded her hands on the table. I want to know if you have the honesty to sit across from me and say what this actually is. Malcolm looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted. Not remorse, nothing that soft, but a recalibration. The decision to drop 1 layer of the performance because the performance was costing him time he'd apparently decided he didn't need to spend. It's a takeover, he said. Orderly, efficient. Do-yoon built something significant. He also became a liability. Organizations require transitions. And I was the obstacle. You were the instrument. The companies in your name were always going to be the mechanism of transition, one way or another. You being married to Do-yoon made it complicated. You leaving made it cleaner. You made me leave. Do-yoon made you leave. He said it without heat. Factually. I provided the conditions. He made every choice you needed him to make. A slight tilt of the head. He's a man who loves power more than people. I simply arranged for that to be visible at the right moment. Yuna shifted her weight. A small movement. Amara's eyes moved to her for a half-second and back. And Yuna, Amara said. Yuna said nothing. She had her own motivations, Malcolm said. Do-yoon had promised her a position in the Vancouver consolidation 2 years ago and reneged. People respond to unmet promises in predictable ways. Amara looked at Yuna directly. Is that accurate? Yuna's jaw tightened. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. You had someone pull my phone records. You knew when I had prenatal appointments. You were deliberately available when my husband chose to be somewhere other than with his family. Amara kept her voice clinical. Not angry. She couldn't afford anger. Not yet. Not until she had everything she needed on record. I want to understand if you were a participant in this or an instrument. I made my own choices, Yuna said. The same way you made yours. The same way Do-yoon made his, Amara said. I know. She turned back to Malcolm. The photograph taken at 4:49 in the morning on Jeju, she said. The one showing Do-yoon on the villa terrace, time-stamped during the hour my son was born. That was specific. That required someone inside the villa. Yes. Who? A staff member with appropriate motivation. He said it with the casual precision of a man discussing a personnel decision. And the succession crisis with Vancouver has been managed. Shinwoo Park is a cautious man. Cautious men respond to demonstrated stability. Once the transfer documents are executed, I can offer him the stability he requires. And your 4 men in the corners of this room. Insurance, Malcolm said. You brought your own, I assume. I came alone. He studied her. Do-yoon isn't outside. Do-yoon is in Seattle. She held his gaze. You took something from him. He's not capable of strategic patience right now. I am. Malcolm almost smiled. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in months. He slid the document case toward her. The instruments are marked where your signature is required. There are 7 locations. Your standard legal signature, not the shortened social version, the full registered signature as it appears on the original company documents. Amara opened the case. She looked at the documents. 7 flagged locations, her full legal signature, Amara Christine Whitfield. She looked at the pen Malcolm had placed beside the case. She thought about Sloane's team at the north and east access points, about the transmitter in her left sleeve, about the 72 minutes of conversation that had just been recorded, Malcolm's voice describing the takeover, the arranged affairs, Clara Park, the villa photographer, the Vancouver manipulation, all of it specific, all of it in his own words. She reached for the pen. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker. A complete and simultaneous death of all 3 work lights, dropping the terminal into the gray dark of winter morning, filtering through broken windows. In the sudden blackness, Amara heard fast movement, the guards repositioning, the scrape of a chair, and Malcolm's voice cutting through the dark, sharp for the first time since she'd met him. Check her. Hands grabbed her arm, the left arm. She went rigid. A light, a phone flashlight, hit her face and then her sleeve, and the man holding her arm ran his other hand along the lining with the specific pressure of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. He found it in 11 seconds. The transmitter came free with a tearing sound that seemed enormous in the silent terminal. Malcolm stood across the table, the flashlight illuminating his face from below, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked like something other than the careful financial strategist who arrived 4 minutes early to every meeting. Military grade, he said. He dropped the transmitter on the concrete floor and stepped on it once, deliberately. I had my people evaluate federal surveillance equipment 6 months ago, in preparation. He looked at her. Who was listening? Amara said nothing. Who was outside? Nobody, she said. One of the guards moved to the terminal's east entry and looked through a gap in the boarding. Clear, he said. North? A beat. Clear. Malcolm came around the table. He stood close, not touching her, but close enough that she could see the specific quality of his focus had changed. The pleasant meeting room surface was gone. What was underneath it was something older and less managed. You came here with a federal wire and no backup, he said. That means either you're incompetent, which I don't believe, or the backup is coming but isn't here yet, which means you need to keep me talking. He tilted his head. How long? Amara looked at him. I'm not going to tell you that, she said. He picked up the unsigned documents from the table. He looked at them. Then he took out his own phone and turned it so she could see the screen. A live feed. A vehicle, she recognized it from the shape, from the specific dent in the rear quarter panel. Zora's backup car, parked outside what looked like the Tacoma field office. Her stomach dropped. I have 2 men in Tacoma, Malcolm said quietly. They're not inside the federal facility. They don't need to be, they just need to be outside. He let her look at the feed for 5 seconds. Sign the documents and they drive away. Don't sign, and I make a call, and your sister discovers what leverage actually looks like. Amara stared at the screen. Zora's car. The field office parking lot. The timestamp on the feed was live. She could see it incrementing in the corner. 11:47:23, 11:47:24, 11:47:25. Eli was in that car. Everything she had built, the transmitter, the recorded confession, the federal positioning, had been visible to Malcolm from a different angle than she'd assumed. He hadn't just prepared for a meeting. He had prepared for a setup. He had let her set it up, let her believe she was controlling the variables, and he had positioned his own pieces around hers while she was watching the board she thought she was playing. 60 seconds, he said. She looked at the documents. She looked at the pen. She picked it up. And then she wrote, carefully and deliberately, at the first flagged location, Amara Whitfield. Not Amara Christine Whitfield. Not the full registered legal signature as it appeared on the original company documents. Just Amara Whitfield. Her name, her actual name, the name she had been signing on personal letters and birthday cards and grocery lists for 35 years, but not the name that appeared on the company registration documents. Not the legal signature that would make the transfer valid. Malcolm watched her sign. Then he extended his hand for the documents, and she gave them to him, and he looked at the first signature. His eyes stilled. That's not... The terminal doors came apart. Not opened, came apart. the east and north entries simultaneously, with the specific concussive force of a federal breach team that had been waiting exactly 90 seconds from the moment the transmitter signal died, which was precisely the protocol Sloan had described, which meant the transmitter dying had been the signal, not a failure, which meant Sloan had prepared for the military-grade sweep, which meant the 6% had been accounted for in a way Amara had not been told because Sloan needed her reaction to the transmitter's discovery to be genuine. Light and noise and the hard specific commands of federal agents filled the terminal from both directions simultaneously. Malcolm moved. He moved faster than a 60-year-old man in a dark suit had any right to move. Years of operating in environments where speed was survival apparently left muscle memory, regardless of age. And he had Amara's arm in one hand and a weapon that had been on his person the entire time pressed beneath her jaw before the agents were fully through the entry points. "Stop!" His voice had gone to something raw. "Stop! Stop right now!" The agent stopped. 17 feet between Amara and the east entry. 12 feet between Amara and the two agents who had come through the north. Malcolm's back was to the windows. She could feel his breath against her temple, fast, shallow, the breath of a man whose plan had fractured and who was now operating on a different kind of calculation entirely. Una was against the far wall, hands visible, not moving. The 4 guards had their own weapons out, but were reading the room. 8 federal agents, body armor, clearly outgunned, and she could see at least 2 of them doing the math and not liking the answer. "The documents are invalid," Malcolm said. His voice was controlled, but the control was working harder than it had been 10 minutes ago. "The signature doesn't transfer anything." "Federal agents are aware," a voice said from the east entry. Agent Cortez. "Mr. Ree, put the weapon down. Back up, everyone back up or Malcolm," Do-Yoon's voice, from the east entry, walking through the breach point with his hands visible and his eyes on Malcolm and the particular stillness of a man who has decided something irrevocable and is on the other side of the deciding. Malcolm's grip on Amara's arm tightened. "You handed them the ledger," he said. Not a question. Something between disbelief and something that might have been grief if grief was something Malcolm Ree was capable of. "You destroyed your own empire." "Yes," Do-Yoon said. He kept walking, slowly. Agents on either side of him, not restraining him, letting him move. "Let her go, Malcolm. You destroyed everything, for a woman who's divorcing you." His voice cracked on the last word. Not emotionally, structurally, the crack of a man whose framework for understanding motivation is encountering something it wasn't built to process. "She's leaving you. The organization is gone. You have nothing." "I know," Do-Yoon said. "I was 12 feet away now. 10. Let her go." "Give me a reason." Do-Yoon stopped. He looked at Malcolm, not with hatred, not with the cold executive fury Amara had seen him deploy in boardrooms, and in the specific moments when someone had underestimated him badly enough to trigger a response. What was in his face was something quieter and more permanent. "Because my son is going to know my name," Do-Yoon said, "and I need it to mean something he can live with. That's the only reason I have left." He held Malcolm's gaze. "It's enough." Malcolm's weapon hand trembled once. Amara felt it, the slight vibration transmitted through the metal pressed against her jaw. And she understood that the trembling was not fear. It was the specific physiological response of a man who has spent 60 years operating from a position where every variable was controlled, and who is standing in a room where none of them are. She brought her left arm up fast and hard, elbow driving into Malcolm's forearm, the same motion, the same specific angle she had thought through on the drive from Portland, because she had always known there was a version of this moment, and she had decided she would not be still inside it. The weapon discharged. Into the ceiling, plaster and snow dust coming down in a white cloud. Do-Yoon crossed the remaining distance in 2 steps, and had the weapon and had Malcolm's wrist, and had put himself between Amara and Malcolm in a single continuous movement that she registered as 3 separate events, and her body registered as one. She stepped back. Malcolm was on the floor. Not from violence, from the sudden collapse of forward momentum with nothing left to push against. I was on his knees on the cracked terminal concrete with Do-Yoon standing over him, and 8 federal agents converging from 2 directions. "Do it," Malcolm said, looking up at Do-Yoon. His face had gone to something unguarded in a way she had never seen on it. "You've lost everything already. Do it." Do-Yoon looked at the weapon in his hand. His jaw was tight. She could see the muscle working. She could see, across the space of 12 feet in 3 months, and a marriage that had died in a hospital room at 6:47 in the morning, exactly what the old version of Kang Do-yoon would have done in this moment, and exactly what it would have cost both of them. Do-yoon. His name, her voice, just that. He looked at her. She shook her head. Once. He looked at the weapon for 2 more seconds. The specific length of time it takes a man to say goodbye to something he has been for a very long time. And then he lowered it. Eli will inherit enough consequences from me, he said quietly. Not to Malcolm. To the space between himself and the decision he'd just declined to make. He won't inherit this. He held the weapon out to Agent Cortez. Cortez took it. Malcolm was handcuffed within the next 30 seconds. Yuna didn't resist. She had been against the wall the entire time with her hands visible, and when an agent approached her, she extended her wrists with the specific resigned composure of someone who has known for a long time that a particular road ends at a particular place and has arrived there. The 4 guards had made their calculations. They were already on their knees. Amara stood in the center of the terminal while federal agents moved around her and snow blew in through the broken windows and the work lights, which someone had cut from outside, she understood now, her own side planned, came back on one by one, and the terminal stopped being a trap and became just a building. A cold, large, ruined building full of people and consequences. Rebecca Sloan walked in through the north entry in a heavy coat, her reading glasses on their chain, a tablet in her hand. She looked at the room the way she always looked at rooms, like a document she was reading for what it was hiding. She looked at Amara first. The recording is intact, she said. Up to the sweep. 63 minutes of admissible material. She looked at Do-yoon. Mr. Kang, my office has received the ledger. She paused. I need you to come with me. Do-yoon looked at Amara. She didn't look away. He removed the watch from his wrist, the watch she had given him on his 38th birthday, a specific object she had forgotten she remembered, and the fact that he was still wearing it did something to her chest that she was not going to examine right now, not here, not in front of federal agents and broken windows and the wreckage of a plan that had almost killed her. He set it on the table beside the unsigned documents. Then Kang Do-yoon, who had commanded port officials and Vancouver partners and a room full of dangerous men for 15 years, extended both wrists to Rebecca Sloan's agents with the specific stillness of a man who has finished fighting the thing he needed to stop fighting. The handcuffs closed. He looked at Amara one more time. She looked back. There were 100 things in that look, and none of them were fixable, and both of them knew it, and that was the most honest thing that had passed between them in 3 years. Then the agents walked him toward the north entry, and Amara stood in the cold terminal with snow drifting through the broken windows above her, and she waited until the door closed, and she breathed, in, out, once. Then she took out her phone and called Zora. It's done, she said when her sister picked up. We're okay. Tell me he's okay. Zora's voice came back immediately, and in the background, Amara could hear the specific sound of Eli making the particular noise he made when he was awake, and not yet hungry and content to simply exist in the world with no agenda. A sound she had memorized in 6 weeks with the thoroughness of someone memorizing the one thing they could not afford to lose. He's fine, Zora said. He's been chewing on these keys for 40 minutes. Amara closed her eyes. I'm coming, she said. The drive from the ferry terminal back to Tacoma took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Amara spent most of it looking out the passenger window at the coastal highway, unwinding in reverse. The same gray water, the same winter light, the same distance between things that had looked so absolute on the drive up and now looked like something else entirely. Not smaller, just more specific. The way everything looks after a crisis passes, and the world stops being a set of variables to calculate and becomes just the world again, with weather and distance and the ordinary weight of what comes next. Agent Cortez drove. He didn't talk, which she appreciated. In the back seat, the manila folder with the unsigned documents sat on the empty seat beside her. She had picked it up from the terminal floor without thinking about it, the way you pick up something that belongs to you, even when you're not sure yet what you're going to do with it. The transfers were void. Malcolm was in federal custody, Yuna was in federal custody, and Rebecca Sloan had enough recorded material and documentary evidence to keep both of them in legal proceedings for the better part of a decade. The companies in Amara's name would remain in Amara's name until a court determined otherwise, which meant they would remain in Amara's name for a significant amount of time. And what she did with them was now a question that had no urgency and no gun behind it. That was new. She hadn't realized how completely the last 6 weeks had been structured around urgency until the urgency stopped. It left a strange, quiet space that she didn't know yet what to fill with. She called Gideon Price from the car. He answered on the third ring with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to express surprise at the nature of calls he received from clients in complicated situations. "The federal action has concluded," she said. "Malcolm Rhee is in custody. I'll need you to review the asset situation and advise on next steps. Not today. This week." "Are you and Eli safe?" "Yes." "Good. Call me when you're ready." A pause. "Amara, well done." She put the phone in her pocket. Well done. As if she had managed a difficult negotiation successfully, which she supposed was accurate enough from the outside. From the inside, it felt considerably less clean, more like having survived something than having won something, though she understood those were not always different. Zora was waiting at the field office with Eli on her hip, and the ring of plastic keys in her hand, and the specific expression of a woman who has been sitting in a federal building for 4 hours holding a baby and running every possible outcome through her head, and is now looking at her sister with the relief of someone who had not let herself prepare for the worst outcome, but who had been aware of it the entire time. Amara walked across the parking lot, and Zora transferred Eli without a word, and Amara stood in the cold Tacoma afternoon holding her son against her shoulder with both arms and didn't say anything either for a long moment. Eli grabbed her collar. "Hey," she said quietly, to the top of his head. Just that. "Hey." He made the noise he made. The content, no agenda noise. She held him tighter. Zora put her hand on the back of Amara's neck. Not a hug, just a hand. The specific comfort of contact that doesn't require you to change your position or compose your face. And Amara stood between the federal building and the gray sky and let herself have 30 seconds of being entirely unable to be strategic. 30 seconds. Then she straightened. "Let's find somewhere to eat," she said. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." "There's a diner 2 blocks over," Cortez said from somewhere behind her. "Good eggs." Zora looked at the federal agent. "You've been very decent," she said. Cortez looked slightly surprised. "Thank you, ma'am." The diner had good eggs. The legal process that followed Malcolm Rhee's arrest moved the way federal criminal proceedings always move, with the grinding, incremental deliberateness of a system that was built to be thorough rather than fast, and that applied the same methodical weight to the significant and the procedural without distinguishing between them. Malcolm was charged with conspiracy, extortion, criminal coercion, wire fraud, and a succession of financial crimes that the Black Crane Ledger documented with the kind of evidentiary specificity that made his legal team's position immediately and obviously untenable. He pleaded not guilty at arraignment. He changed that plea 11 weeks later, when Uniceo's cooperation agreement with Sloan's office became public record. Una cooperated fully. Amara had known she would, had read it in that slight excess of alertness at the terminal, in the way Una had kept her hands visible before she was asked to, in the fact that a woman who had gotten into this for reasons of her own grievance was not the same kind of person as a man who had spent 14 months constructing a corporate coup. Una had made choices. She had also been used. Those things were simultaneously true, and Sloan's office had apparently decided that the first was less prosecutable than the second was useful. Clara Park was charged separately. 18 months, reduced for cooperation, which she provided with the desperate speed of someone who had told herself for 14 months that she didn't know what she was enabling and who had stopped being able to maintain that particular self-deception approximately 30 seconds after her arrest. Amara did not attend any of the proceedings. She read the summaries Gideon sent her and filed them, and did not spend time constructing a feeling about Clara Park that was larger than the situation required. She had enough things to construct feelings about. The divorce became final on a Thursday morning in February, in a courtroom Amara attended with Gideon and Zora, in a proceeding that lasted 40 minutes and that felt both enormously significant and strangely administrative. The legal system's method of acknowledging the end of something it had also acknowledged the beginning of, with the same paperwork energy applied to both. Do-yoon did not contest a single condition: full custody of Eli to Amara. Generous child support, structured through a legal instrument that did not depend on Do-yoon's continued freedom or financial position to function. Gideon had insisted on that architecture, and Do-yoon's attorney had agreed without pushback. Visitation rights designated as supervised and subject to Amar's discretion during the period of Do-yoon's incarceration, with a framework for renegotiation once he was released and had demonstrated, the document used the specific word demonstrated, sustained changed behavior over a documented period. Do-yoon signed every page. His attorney had apparently advised him to push back on the custody structure, to negotiate a more favorable visitation framework, to at minimum request a specific timeline for the renegotiation clause. Do-yoon had declined all of it. Gideon told her this afterward, over coffee in the corridor outside the courtroom. He told his attorney the terms were acceptable, Gideon said, with the careful neutrality of a lawyer describing a negotiation outcome. Verbatim, apparently, they're acceptable. Don't negotiate. Amara turned her coffee cup in her hands. Okay, she said. It's an unusually clean settlement, Gideon said, for a situation this complicated. He's not trying to win anything, she said. That's what unusually clean looks like. She returned to Seattle 3 weeks after the divorce was final. Not to the penthouse. That was Do-yoon's, and she had no desire to reclaim it, no desire to occupy square footage that had been a gilded form of loneliness for the last 2 years of her marriage. She rented an apartment in Capitol Hill, 3rd floor, south-facing windows, a kitchen with a gas stove, and enough counter space to actually use, a second bedroom that she set up for Eli with the careful attention of someone building a room for a person rather than furnishing a space. She bought a crib that required assembly. She and Zora spent 4 hours assembling it incorrectly, and then correctly, with a level of profanity that Eli appeared to find entertaining from his position on the blanket on the floor, and at the end of it the crib was level and solid and the room was a room, and Amara stood in the doorway looking at it with the specific satisfaction of something built with her own hands that would hold the weight she needed it to hold. Zora stayed for the first month. Then she went back to her own life in a way that felt healthy rather than abandoning. She was 40 minutes away, and she came on Wednesdays and Sundays, and she texted with the frequency of a woman who needed to know her sister was okay, and who had learned over 6 weeks of emergency that she could trust Amara's judgment about when to say so. The companies in Amara's name required decisions. She made them over the course of 3 months, with Gideon's counsel and the advice of 2 financial consultants she hired independently, not from Do-yoon's network, not from anyone connected to the shipping world she'd spent 3 years inside. 2 of the companies she restructured cleanly and legitimately, stripping the shell architecture Malcolm had been trying to exploit, bringing in auditors who documented everything, and establishing governance structures that would hold up to any scrutiny because there was nothing in them to hide. One she dissolved because its only function had ever been the cash flow function, and there was no version of it that served a legitimate purpose she wanted to be responsible for. The 4th was the interesting one. Pacific Meridian Logistics, originally incorporated as a shell, but carrying a legitimate freight brokerage license that Amara had quietly built into something functional during the 2nd year of her marriage, when she was building infrastructure because building things was how she stayed sane inside a marriage that was slowly becoming a beautiful cage. It had 6 real clients, real contracts, real movement of real freight through real ports. She had built it almost by accident, the way you sometimes build things when your hands need somewhere useful to go. She kept it. She hired a general manager, a woman named Deborah Wells, 50 years old, formerly of a mid-size freight operation in Portland, with 22 years of logistics experience and the specific competence of someone who had spent 2 decades being good at a job without being positioned to run things, and who was ready to actually run something. Pacific Meridian Logistics would not be a shell for anyone's cash flow. It would be a company. She had a meeting with Deborah Wells in April, in a coffee shop in Sodu, with Eli and a carrier on her chest, and a folder of organizational documents on the table between them. Deborah looked at Eli once, looked at the documents, and said, "What are the actual numbers?" Amara told her the actual numbers. Deborah looked at them for 30 seconds. "I can work with that." She looked up. "What do you want this to be?" "Profitable and clean," Amara said. "That's the whole brief." "I can do profitable and clean." "Good. Do that." Do-yoon was sentenced in March. She didn't attend the sentencing. She knew the outcome before it happened. Gideon had been tracking the proceedings, and Sloan's office had provided sufficient information about the cooperation agreement's impact on the sentencing recommendation that the range was known in advance. 7 years, reduced from a potential 14 by the scope and quality of his cooperation with the federal investigation. Mandatory minimum on the conspiracy charge, plus concurrent sentencing on the financial crimes. Possibility of parole review after 4 years. He was remanded to a federal correctional facility in eastern Washington. Not far, in the geography of things, though distance in this situation was not primarily a physical measurement. He wrote her a letter, not a letter to her. He was careful about that. It was addressed to both of them, Amara and Eli, and it arrived through Gideon's office in April, 2 months after sentencing, folded in a plain envelope with Do-yoon's handwriting on the outside in the careful, slightly formal script of someone who had learned English as a second language, and who had always written it with a precision that English first speakers rarely bothered with. She read it alone at the kitchen table after Eli was asleep. It was 3 pages. He did not explain himself or ask for anything. He described the facility, factually, without complaint or self-pity. He described what he was doing with his time, a finance course offered through a community college program, a reading group, morning exercise. He asked after Eli's development with the specific questions of a man who had been watching the monthly photographs Amara had agreed through Gideon to provide. Questions about the things in the photographs, about whether Eli was walking yet, about the red coat he was wearing in the most recent one. At the end of the 3rd page, he had written 1 paragraph about himself. She read it twice. I have had a great deal of time to consider what I chose and why I chose it. I have not arrived at a satisfying explanation. I think the honest answer is that I had built a life in which power was the evidence of value, and you had become part of that life without ever being reduced to it. And I treated the distinction as unimportant until it was too late to correct. I am not telling you this to generate a response. I'm telling you because I want Eli to eventually know that his father understood what he did and did not spend his time in here telling himself a different story about it. She folded the letter. She put it in the back of the blue notebook, the Portland notebook, still in the drawer of the kitchen table, still carrying the record of Eli's first weeks in a world his father had not been present for. Then she sat at the kitchen table in her apartment and drank her coffee and listened to the sound of Eli breathing through the baby monitor on the counter, and she thought about what it cost to tell the truth about yourself when the truth was not flattering, and there was no immediate reward for the telling. She wrote back. Not much. 2 paragraphs through Gideon. Eli is pulling himself up on furniture. He has 4 teeth. He recognizes your voice from the recordings. I don't know what to tell you about the rest of it yet, but I'm telling you about him because he deserves a father who knows what he's doing in the world, even from a distance. The supervised video calls began in May. Every second Sunday, 30 minutes, through the facility's program for incarcerated parents. A counselor present on Do-yoon's end. Amara present on Eli's end, with the laptop set up on the kitchen table so the light was good and Eli could sit in his high chair within frame. The first call was awkward in the specific way of any first attempt at a new kind of thing. Too much silence, too much compensation for the silence. Do-yoon's face on the screen looked older than the last time she'd actually been in a room with him, which had been the terminal, which had been a specific kind of last time that carried its own weight. He looked at Eli for a long moment before he said anything. Eli looked at the screen with the open, uncomplicated curiosity of a baby encountering a face he had been hearing for months on the recordings Amara had been playing. She had started playing them when Eli was 6 weeks old, Do-yoon reading from whatever was available. The finance coursework, a news article, a letter he wrote specifically for the recordings. And so Eli's face when he looked at the screen was not the face of a stranger encountering a stranger. It was something else, not recognition exactly. More like familiarity without a frame for it yet, the way you sometimes know a voice before you know the face. "Hi, buddy," Do-yoon said. His voice came out rough on the first word and he cleared his throat. Eli reached toward the screen with one hand, fingers spread, in the way he reached for things he wanted to touch. Do-yoon watched his son's hand. Something moved through his face that Amara had no name for, and that she filed away without attaching anything to it, because some things were not hers to interpret. And this was one of them. The calls did not get less awkward quickly. They got less awkward slowly, over months, in the way that things built incrementally acquire stability, not from a single load-bearing moment, but from the accumulation of consistent small weight. By August, Eli was saying something that approximated data in the general direction of the laptop on Sunday mornings, which Do-yoon received the first time with a stillness that lasted almost 10 seconds, and that Amara did not comment on. She did not make the calls easy or hard. She made them available. That was the line she had drawn for herself, and she held it. Do-yoon never asked for more than what the calls provided. He never asked what she was thinking or how she was, or whether there was any version of a future that included him in a way that went beyond the screen. He asked about Eli. He asked whether the company was developing the way she'd hoped. He asked once, carefully, whether Zora was well. He never asked about himself. Not once. She noticed. The months arranged themselves into a year. Eli's first birthday was a Saturday in June. Amara and Zora and three of Amara's friends from her pre-Seattle life. People who had existed before Do-yoon and who had waited with the patient loyalty of people who understood that their friend needed to find her way back to herself before she could find her way back to them. A cake with one candle. Eli destroying the cake with the methodical concentration of someone encountering their first significant responsibility. Photographs that Amara sent through Gideon the following Monday. Do-yoon's letter came back within a week. He had studied each photograph, she could tell. His questions were specific in a way that required close looking. Who made the cake? Was that Zora's apartment in the background? What was Eli holding in the third photograph? It looked like a wooden spoon. She answered all three questions. Pacific Meridian Logistics turned its first quarterly profit in September. Deborah Wells sent her a one-line email. Numbers look good. Amara printed it and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a crab that Zora had given her as a housewarming joke. And she stood in front of the refrigerator and looked at the email and at the crab magnet and felt the specific quiet satisfaction of something built correctly, doing the thing it was built to do. She was working, really working, the way she had worked before the marriage had slowly absorbed her capacity for it. Not managing someone else's infrastructure, not correcting someone else's contracts, but building something with her signature on it in the way that actually counted. She had 2 employees, she had 6 clients. She had a general manager who sent her direct messages at 10 at night about freight routing with the confidence of someone who expected the messages would be welcomed. They were welcomed. She was tired in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. That was different. Do-yoon had been inside for a year and 4 months when the call came from the facility counselor about a program review. Not parole, it was too early for parole, but a review of his participation in the rehabilitation programming that would affect his parole eligibility timeline. The counselor called Amara as the designated family contact because the program required it, not because it required anything from her, but because she was on the form. She answered the counselor's questions. Yes, he had maintained consistent contact with his son. Yes, the contact had been within the framework they'd established. No, she could not speak to his internal state. She could speak to his behavior in the interactions she had observed. The counselor paused. That's exactly the right answer, she said, with the mild surprise of someone accustomed to more complicated responses. Most people either overstate or understate. I try to describe what I see, Amara said. He's doing the work, the counselor said, for whatever that's worth to you. It's worth something, Amara said. I don't know what yet. The park meeting happened when Eli was nearly 4. It had not been a sudden decision. It had been a long process of consideration that Amara had undertaken the same way she undertook everything she cared about. Methodically, without rushing toward an answer she wanted, without flinching from the ones she didn't. She had spoken with the family therapist twice, not because she was uncertain about her own position, but because she wanted to be clear-eyed about Eli's developmental needs, and what the research actually said about children who had incarcerated parents and the kinds of contact that helped them versus the kinds that complicated them. The research said, presence matters. Consistent, non-dramatic, age-appropriate presence. She had set the terms with Do-yoon through Gideon, precisely as she set every term now. Not as punishment, not as performance of power, but as the structure that made the thing possible. A public park. Professional family supervision from the therapist she worked with. 1 hour. 10 a.m. Saturday. She had told Eli the week before. Not with elaborate preparation. He was 3.5. An elaborate preparation for 3-year-olds created anxiety more than it resolved it. But simply, you're going to meet your dad in person. We've seen him on the computer. Saturday you'll see him at the park. Eli had thought about this with the focused seriousness he applied to things that mattered. Does he know how to push swings? He asked. I think he can figure it out, she said. Okay, Eli said, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Saturday arrived cold and clear, February. The kind of Seattle February where the rain stops for a few days, and the city looks sharp and temporary, like the weather is being careful not to commit to anything. Amara drove to the park on the river with Zora in the passenger seat and Eli in the back in his car seat wearing the red coat, which he had opinions about now and which he wore because he wanted to, not because she had chosen it. She had looked up where Do-yoon was living, through Gideon, not for any strategic reason, just because it was information she needed to understand the terms of the situation she was walking into. He was renting a house in Burien, south of the city, modest by the standards of what he'd lived with before, which was an almost meaningless measurement. I was working at a freight management company, not shipping, warehouse operations, ground level, a job that someone had apparently given him through a connection that had nothing to do with his former identity in the industry. He had been going to counseling once a week since his release. He had turned down 3 separate approaches from former associates offering, in various framings, paths back to operational involvement in things she did not want detailed. Gideon had noted this last item with the careful neutrality of someone conveying information they thought was relevant. She had noted it back the same way. The park was a long green strip along the river, with a playground at the south end and a wide walking path that followed the bank. At 9:58, Amara came along the path from the north with Zora and Eli between them, and she could see from 40 yards out the figure sitting on a bench near the playground entrance, very still, hands on his knees. He was wearing a dark coat she didn't recognize. His hair was shorter than she remembered. He was watching the path with the focused attention of a man who has been there for a while and who has decided that stillness is the correct position for this particular waiting. She had told him 10 o'clock. He had arrived at 9:27, Gideon had mentioned, because the park supervisor had texted to confirm the early arrival. 9:27, no car service, no security. A bus transfer that took 45 minutes from Burien because he didn't have a car yet. He arrived at 9:27 and he sat on the bench and he waited. Eli saw him from 20 yards out. He didn't run immediately. He stopped first, which was characteristic of Eli, who processed before he moved, who had his father's quality of stillness before action and his mother's quality of taking measure before committing. He stood on the path and looked at the man on the bench, the same way he looked at the screen on Sunday mornings. That same particular assessment of a face he knew from a context that was now being presented in a different form. Do-yoon saw him at the same moment. He stayed on the bench. He didn't stand, didn't move toward, didn't make any gesture that could be read as pressure. He sat on the bench with his hands on his knees and let Eli decide. Eli decided in about 4 seconds. He ran. I was 3.5, and 3.5-year-olds run the way they do everything, with total commitment and not much refinement. And he closed the 20 yards in a series of rapid, slightly uncoordinated strides that ended when he crashed into Do-yoon's arms with the full kinetic investment of someone who had decided this was the destination and had not budgeted for a gentle arrival. Do-yoon caught him. He dropped to one knee as Eli hit him, and he caught him and he held on, and Amara, who had been watching from 20 feet back, looked at the space between her and the bench and let herself feel the full complicated weight of the moment without managing it into something smaller. She let it be what it was. Zora put her hand through Amara's arm and said nothing. The next hour was not dramatic. That was the thing about it, the absence of drama, the ordinary texture of it. Eli wanted to go on the swings. He was specific about the swings, and he pulled Do-yoon toward them with the authority of a child who has identified a goal and is recruiting the nearest available adult for its achievement. Do-yoon pushed the swing. Higher, Eli said, so he pushed higher. Stop, Eli said, when the swing had achieved a height that apparently satisfied some internal metric. Do-yoon stopped pushing. Watch me, Eli said, about 17 different things over the course of the hour. So Do-yoon watched. Amara sat on a bench nearby with Zora and the family therapist, whose name was Dr. Reeves, and who had been briefed on the full situation with the careful thoroughness of a professional who understood that full briefings prevented surprises and who observed the hour with the particular quality of professional attention that is indistinguishable from the outside from simply sitting quietly. He's good with him, Dr. Reeves said at one point. Not a judgment, just an observation, the kind of note you make when data presents itself. Yes, Amara said. She watched Do-yoon on the playground and thought about the version of him she had known in those early years, before the empire had fully calcified around him. The version who had once argued with her at 2 a.m. about contract language because he cared about getting it right, who had laughed at something she said with the unguarded laughter of a man who was briefly not in charge of anything. She had thought about that version a great deal over the last 3 years. Not with longing, or not primarily with longing. More with the specific sadness of understanding that a person can be genuinely two things at once, can be both the man worth loving and the man who chose somewhere else, and that both of those things are the same person and you cannot have one without the other. She had made her peace with that. Not the peace of acceptance without cost, the peace of a woman who has decided that the cost has been paid and that she is not going to keep adding to the receipt. When the hour was ending, Do-yoon came and crouched beside Eli to say goodbye, and Eli looked at him with the focused assessment he'd used at the beginning of the hour. "Will you come next Saturday?" Eli said. Do-yoon looked at him for a moment. Then he looked up, across the 10 feet of park path between them, and he looked at Amara. She walked over. She stood close enough that Eli could see both of them at once, which she understood instinctively was the important thing, that Eli needed to see them in the same frame and understand they were capable of coexisting in it. "We'll discuss it," she said to Eli. Eli frowned. He was familiar with this phrase and its implications, and he had opinions about them. Do-yoon crouched beside him. "That means your mother decides what keeps you safe." He held Eli's gaze with the directness he'd always used with adults, but which he was apparently also capable of deploying with a small person in a red coat. "And I listen." Eli processed this. "Okay," he said. With the tone of someone granting a concession, he expects to negotiate further at a later time. He ran back toward the swings. Amara and Do-yoon stood on the park path. The river moved behind them, cold and gray and continuous, the way rivers are always moving regardless of what's happening on the bank. They looked at each other. There was no version of what she wanted to say that fit inside the space available, and she had learned over the last 3 years that forcing things into insufficient space was how you broke them, so she didn't try to say everything. She said the things she could. "He's a good kid," she said. "He is." Do-yoon's voice was quiet. "He's yours. He's also yours. That's the thing you're going to have to learn to hold." Do-yoon looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means he has your attention span and your patience and the way you go still before you move." She said it without warmth or resentment, just accurately, the way you describe a fact that requires description. He's going to need to know that doesn't make him dangerous. It just makes him particular. Do-yoon looked toward the swings, where Eli was climbing the ladder with the focused determination of someone who had decided that climbing was preferable to waiting for someone to push him. "I'll work on that," he said. They stood there for another moment, and Amara thought about all the chairs. Every chair that had ever been empty in the story of her marriage. The hospital chair, the dining table chair, the chair she had prepared beside her hospital bed and watched stay empty, while she held their son alone for the first hours of his life. She thought about what it had cost her to stop being angry about the chairs and start being responsible for the space they'd left behind. She thought about the apartment in Capitol Hill with the gas stove and the crib she'd assembled incorrectly, and then correctly, about the blue notebook, about the photograph in the back of it that she had not thrown away. She didn't take him back. She had known for 3 years that taking him back was not the shape of the thing that was available here, and she had made that peace not quickly or easily, but thoroughly, in the way you make peace with things that cost you something real. What was available was smaller and more specific and in certain ways more difficult. The ongoing practice of allowing a man who had failed her in an irreversible way to become, incrementally, something that their son needed him to be. Not for Do-yoon's sake, not for hers, for Eli, who had his father's stillness and his mother's precision, and who deserved, in the way every child deserves, to be shaped by both of them rather than only one. That was the work. It was not dramatic work. It didn't look like anything from the outside except 2 adults standing on a park path beside a river while a small person in a red coat climbed a ladder and decided to come back down and decided to climb again. But it was the hardest work she'd done in 3 years, and she was going to do it. "We'll see about Saturday," she said. He nodded, didn't push, didn't fill the space with anything she hadn't offered. Eli suddenly turned around at the top of the ladder. 10 o'clock next Saturday, he announced to both of them, in the specific tone of a person issuing a decree rather than making a request. Do-yoon looked at her. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she gave him a small nod. 10 o'clock, he called to Eli. Eli appeared satisfied. He descended the ladder with the same total commitment he'd used to climb it and made for the swings. Amara turned and walked toward the path. Zora fell into step beside her. "Doctor, Reeves followed at a professional distance. Behind them, Eli's voice carried on the February air, instructional, specific, directing someone to push and hire and now stop. And she could hear Do-yoon following the directions with the quiet, concentrated attention of a man who understood that this was the work now. Not power, not control, not the architecture of an empire. This, the specific ordinary weight of showing up at 9:27 when you've been told 10 o'clock, not because it earns you anything, not because it's observed, but because when you have already been somewhere else at the worst possible moment, every minute of early is the only language you have left for what you mean. He had no empire, he had no claim. He had a bench in a park, and 43 minutes of early, and a small boy in a red coat who had his stillness and his mother's eyes, and who would grow up understanding two things simultaneously: that the world does not forgive certain absences, and that the people who create them can still choose, in the years that remain, to arrive. The river kept moving. Eli called out from the swings. Amara walked on without looking back, into the clear February morning, into the work of what remained.